Good afternoon, everyone. Librarian Danielle Belanger here from the Cote-Saint-Luc Public Library, joining you virtually. Today, we have another great program for you. The library is thrilled to have the opportunity to host a live conversation with novelist Charlene Carr. Thank you very much, Charlene, for taking the time to speak with me today, all the way from Halifax, and to Lisa at HarperCollins for making this event possible. Thank you also to Andreas at Paragraph Bookstore for collaborating with us on the event. To begin with, I'll share a condensed bio. Charlene Carr is a lover of stories. Pursuing this lifelong obsession, she studied literature at university, obtaining both a BA and MA in English, including a study program at Oxford. Still craving more, she attained a degree in journalism. A bit of a nomad, she's lived in 4 countries and 7 Canadian provinces. After traveling the globe for several years and working as a freelance writer, editor, facilitator, and running her own communications business, she decided that time had come to focus exclusively on her true love, novel writing. She currently lives in Nova Scotia, Canada, where she splits her time between writing, building relationships with her readers, and trying to keep up with the energy and antics of her young daughter. She's previously self-published and has a subscriber list of over 4,500. This is her first agented novel, and she was recently awarded a writing grant by Arts Nova Scotia. Welcome, Charlene.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Before we discuss your first agented novel, Hold My Girl, this one here, let's briefly speak about the fact that you self-published 9 novels and a novella. Is this accurate? And can you tell us a little bit why you chose first the self-publishing route, and then you moved along to the agented route?
Yeah, that's absolutely accurate. So it wasn't intentional to start. So my first novel, Beneath the Silence, I started it when I was 17. I finished it when I was 27. In many ways, it was kind of my baby, this labor of love. And when I finally felt it was ready, I sent it off to maybe 3 or 4 local publishers. And I got some really good feedback, but nobody took it on. And I didn't really know what to do next. I didn't know how to find an agent. As you mentioned, I studied literature in university. And as it turns out, that's really the only type of fiction that I'd read. I had never heard of Kristen Hanna or Jodi Picoult. I was reading, very literary, the type of books that you study in university. And what I wrote at the time, Beneath the Silence, I knew it was good and I liked it and it had value, but it wasn't that. And so I didn't know where its place was. And a friend of mine, this was, I think, around 2013 when self-publishing was really just starting to take off, he really pushed and encouraged me to give that a try. And so Beneath the Silence, which I mentioned was kind of this 10-year labor of love, I was too attached to it to try with that, but I wrote a new novel specifically with the idea of self-publishing. And through that, I started really reaching readers, and it was fun and it was rewarding. And I ended up turning that book into a series. And through that, I started to learn about what else was out there, the other books that were there, and kind of where the books that I was writing at the time fit in the market. And so I continued with that. And then once I became a mother, I realized that basically running your own independent publishing company, which is what I was doing, and trying to write and also be a present mother, I just didn't have the bandwidth for all of that. I was exhausted, and in trying to keep promoting and marketing and just doing everything behind publishing your own books, I didn't have the energy to write. And that was the whole reason I was doing any of this. So I decided when it came time to write my next novel that I would do it in order to try to find an agent and a traditional publisher, and hopefully create a situation for myself where I could focus on writing and have that be my main career focus. And so I did a lot of research into how to find agents and what publishers were looking for and all of that. And thankfully that turned into Hold My Girl.
So can you tell us a bit more about your self-publishing route and how you tackled all of these angles yourself? So promoting the book, did you come up with the cover? Did you Was it word of mouth? Did your family help in any way?
It was mostly, so the first 3 covers, I think I hired a designer, and I didn't have a very large budget. And so then I started teaching myself how to do it. So the rest of the covers, and actually all of the covers that you currently see on my self-published books, I designed them all myself. And, I taught myself how to format. I took courses on marketing and advertising, and just there's Mark Dawson, I believe. Yeah, Mark Dawson and Nick Stevenson are 2 people who are very successful in the self-publishing world, and they develop courses to help authors learn how to kind of replicate their success. And so I just devoted myself and my life to it. Yeah, it was a journey, and it was really exciting, and I learned so much. But what I would need to be successful at it, that advertising, that looking at statistics, that keeping track of market trends, like it's not for me. It drained me. I didn't get any joy out of that side of it. And so I'm so happy to be on this other route now.
Congratulations.
Thank
So
you.
congratulations, Charlene, on a very compelling and riveting novel. I'm referring, of course, to Hold My Girl. So once again, a big thank you to HarperCollins for sending me the book, an advanced reader's copy. So now I will share a synopsis of the plot for those listening in today who maybe haven't had a chance to read it yet, because it's just out almost. January 24th was the date that it came out in Canada. Catherine is a woman full of obsessions, everything clean, everything perfect all the time. After 7 years of trying and failing to conceive, she finally gives birth to Rose, her IVF miracle child. But she's afraid that Rose may not be her daughter. Her pale skin doesn't match Catherine's own. Tess never got her happy ending. She took on IVF alongside Catherine and a group of hopeful mothers, but her daughter Hannah was stillborn. After a series of poor choices, she's divorced, broke, and stuck in a job that's below her skill set. 10 months later, Catherine and Tess get a call from the fertility clinic that reveals shocking news. The 2 women's eggs were switched. While Catherine's perfect life begins to crumble around her, for Tess is the glimmer of hope she needs to get her life back on track. But it will take a custody battle to decide who deserves to be Rose's mother, a battle that will push both women to the brink. So a very riveting story, as I said. Charlene, do you mind sharing what inspired you to write this heart-wrenching novel?
Absolutely. So my own daughter was born via IVF after about a 5-year struggle. And when she was, for the first few months of her life, I was genuinely concerned that there might have been a mistake at the clinic and that she wasn't biologically mine. Usually, most interviews I've done have been written or just podcasts so people can see here. I'm a Black woman, a mixed race Black woman, and my daughter was born visibly white. And so there was a lot of concern there. And it wasn't until, I shouldn't say a lot of concern, there was concern, there was worry, just that possibility. And so most specifically, if she hadn't been mine, what would I owe to the woman out there who biologically was her mother? And so very thankfully, when she was somewhere between 6 to 8 months, her features started changing. So her blonde hair darkened and curled, her skin darkened, her features shifted to look more like mine. And I lost absolutely any fear or concern that she wasn't biologically my daughter. And then, as I mentioned earlier, when I decided, okay, if I'm going to write a novel, I need to find something that's going to draw readers' attention. I need to find something that's going to get publishers excited. And I thought about this experience that I'd went through that thankfully didn't turn into a, newsworthy story. But if it had, how complex that would be, and what the right answer would have been. Because even if my daughter hadn't been biologically my daughter, to me, she was mine. I had grown her inside of me. I had given birth to her. I'd been raising her for months. And so, yeah, when I thought of turning that into a novel, I thought, this is really going to compel people. And it's timely, it's universal, it digs into a question of motherhood. It looks at the the issue of infertility, which is just rampant in our society right now, and I think isn't being talked about nearly as much. Thankfully, that's changing. And in the last decade or so, the conversations are happening that weren't before when I first started on this journey myself. But yeah, that's what led me to it.
Can you tell us what message you want to convey about IVF through this novel, and what surprised you in your research surrounding this subject, if anything?
I mean, I don't necessarily think that there's any particular message about IVF I want to relay, maybe more infertility in general and the struggles that women go through, whether it is IVF, whether it's, IUI or artificial insemination, or just trying to figure out a way to have your own body have a child. Because sometimes there aren't clear answers. I have endometriosis and I have PCOS, and I knew at least what I was battling, though there's not necessarily answers on how to, correct those issues. And I specifically didn't specify in the novel what the women had, because for so many people, there isn't a clear explanation. It's just not happening. And I really wanted to open people's eyes up to what women go through, the struggles, the fears, the insecurity, the feelings of shame and being alone. And hopefully for those who have gone through this struggle, the novel will help them feel less alone and feel more seen. And hopefully for people who haven't, it will open their eyes to people in their lives who are probably going through something similar regarding infertility, and help them to understand a little bit more and have more empathy. And even I remember in my own experience, there were so many times when, 5 years passed and my husband and I still hadn't had children, where there were a lot of inappropriate questions and jokes. And I don't think anyone meant to be inappropriate, but when women are going through that, I should say when couples are going through that, it's extremely painful and it's hard to talk about, and it's not casual conversation to bring up at brunch. I think fertility in general should be private unless the people open up themselves. Like, unless someone offers, it's really not something to ask about.
I thought I vaguely recalled a Canadian case in the news a few years ago. In late 2021, an Ontario Superior Court judge approved the $13.375 million settlement against the disgraced Ottawa fertility doctor Norman Barwin. Did you come across any others when researching your novel? And did you interview women who went through IVF to convey what each woman in the book was going through at different times in the novel?
So I did do a fair amount of research. I came across that case and several others. I can't remember the specifics of them at the moment. That might have been the only big one in Canada. I think some of the others were in other countries. Actually, no, there was a Quebec one in Canada as well that I think was longer ago. I didn't interview any women personally. I, did some kind of general research. I think I felt I had been through enough of it myself and talked to women when I was going through it. I've been in the fertility groups, on Facebook that Catherine and Tessa are in the story, that I felt I had a very good sense of how to portray that. And I didn't necessarily want to pray into another woman's experience. When I felt that if this is something I hadn't gone through, then I feel in order to write the book, I would have really needed to take that step. But yeah, I didn't feel compelled to potentially open things up for someone who might not feel as comfortable with that when I already felt, it's kind of an own voices story in that sense. I've lived it, and I've been living it for a decade. Even after my daughter, we've still struggled to have another child. So yeah.
Thank you for sharing.
You're welcome.
Apart from the physical and emotional toll IVF procedures can take on women and their sense of confidence, you also delve into what harms going through these procedures can cause in couples' relationships, as well as in their families. How did you go about making sure this part rang true or felt authentic? Because I really did feel like it rung very true throughout the novel.
Again, I think my husband and I are very solid, and we're one of the very fortunate couples who, through the struggles and just the stress and pain of IVF, it brought us closer together. But I've certainly known and seen other couples who it's split apart. I've heard a lot of women talk about it in those Facebook groups I've been a part of. I've done my own research. I think I like to, if possible, observe from the world, be it articles, be it blogs, be it other things, to just get a sense rather than drawing from any, one-on-one interview when it is a subject matter that I've personally experienced as well. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of the route that I took. And even I find so often in fiction, even if you haven't experienced certain aspects of what you're writing about, if you've experienced the core or the possibility of that, which I think I have, regarding, stresses that I've lived through, then you can use your imagination to be like, okay, well, if we hadn't been there for each other in this circumstance, if we hadn't taken the time to speak and to, really share what struggles we had, where would it have gone? And yeah, there's a lot of imagination involved in writing a fiction novel, and I draw on that where I can.
So this novel features a dual narrative. Can you tell us a bit more about why you chose this writing style?
So, as I mentioned earlier, the biggest fear for me, if my daughter hadn't biologically been my daughter, would have been, what would I owe to this woman out there who had gone through probably many of the similar stresses and trials in trying to conceive that I had gone through. And I couldn't see how this story could be told without exploring her side of it. And so this was actually an interesting experience that turned the book into something very different than it would have been if I had self-published it, in that when I initially wrote, the story was probably about 65% Catherine, 35% Tess. And I'm sure that's because Catherine's story is much closer to my own. And I definitely knew I wanted Tess's side in there, but it was my agent who kind of opened my eyes to the fact that, this has got to be 50-50. Like, in order for this story to be compelling in the way that you want it to be, and in order for the reader to really be pulled back and forth the way, I wanted to portray, in that who deserves this child, we need to hear Tess's story equally.
In this novel, where motherhood plays a central role, you explore themes of race and class. Can you tell us more about how you weaved these elements through the two women's ongoing battle over the seemingly sometimes perfect baby Rose?
I guess some of it too was pulled from experience, in that there were a lot of moments in my life, especially when my daughter was much younger, when she visibly presented, entirely as a white person, where people made the assumption that she wasn't mine, where I was out with friends, white friends, and, they would talk to my friend in referencing my child and just assuming right away that they were the parent. There was even a situation where an elderly gentleman came up to me and said, like, "Oh, wow, like, what a lucky woman you are to have the job of taking care of this child." And maybe he went the job of motherhood, but my assumption is no. And so it seemed impossible not to weave some of those experiences and some of those moments and perceptions into the plot. And then very largely, where that imagination comes in, and also just from observing society, I think if this happened and this made it to the news, a lot of people would have an issue with a Black mother raising a white child who wasn't biologically hers. And so, we can see examples of racism and prejudice and microaggressions just anywhere you look. And I didn't want it to overtake the plot, and I hope it doesn't, but I thought it was something that absolutely needed to be explored.
I do like that when it does come up and things are going too far in one direction against Catherine, Tess doesn't like this. Both women sort of empathize with the other when things slide kind of below the belt. I did appreciate that.
Oh, good. And I think too that connects to the fact that they both feel like this child's mother, and they both realize the love that they have for the same person.
In terms of the characters in your novel, which did you enjoy writing the most and why?
That's a tricky one. I don't know that there is anyone particularly who I enjoyed writing more. I really liked Tessa's brother, and it's crazy that I can't think of his name at the moment. I'm very deep into my next novel. I'm working on, final revisions for that. So it's been months since I've really dug into or looked at Hold My Girl closely. Yeah, and as far as Catherine and Tess goes, if that's what you were thinking, I don't think there's one I enjoyed more than the other. They're both very different. I care very deeply about both of them. I feel that they're flawed characters that's who I always like to write, flawed characters, and seeing them kind of transform and find who they're meant to be. And I think they both have very different paths toward that. And yeah, no, I can't pick favorites.
Okay. And which characters do you think your readers will identify with? And did you intend in the way you shaped each character for our views, or at least mine, to change throughout the novel as we learn more about their past and their individual stories and backgrounds?
My hope would be that, obviously when you're starting out, you're more likely to empathize or relate to whoever seems more like yourself. And so I can't say who I think readers would, because all readers are different. But I would really hope that by the end of the novel, there's empathy and understanding for both in their situations and what they've gone through and what they've struggled with, and that there wouldn't be any clear favorite. And I can understand how there might be, and I don't want to give spoilers. But yeah, we're all so flawed, and we all make mistakes, and our past plays into that, and our relationships with other people. And I keep coming back to it, but I think empathy and understanding is always what I hope that as we develop that, and as we're reading for these fictional characters, that helps us to see it for the people in our own lives, and to think about the secrets behind their motivations and their seeming flaws that might be the trigger for things that otherwise we wouldn't understand or accept or take the time to just think about.
I think you did a great job at making us empathetic towards each of the women. However, I don't know if it's just me. I had a very hard time with Patrick wanting to wring his neck time and time again throughout the novel. How did Patrick form in your mind?
So, I think too, the initial Patrick, as I portrayed him, maybe was less that way, maybe more likable, more someone that you can have some understanding and empathy for. The novel was much longer in its initial form. And so in trimming that down, Patrick definitely became less of a likable character, because I had to, obviously when a lot more of the novel was on Catherine's story, there was more time to explore their relationship. And I think in order to have more of that understanding or empathy for Patrick, it would have taken more time in the situation, especially because of some of the choices he made. Yeah, and so I think I have more understanding for him than the average character would, the average reader would, because I know a lot more of his experience and backstory than's in the book, obviously. So it's a hard thing as an author to be like, yeah, but when it's not in the pages, right? Yeah, and I think when it came down to it, and it came down to cutting and what had to go and what was most important, was these women and the choices that they were going to make. So I guess in a little sense, Patrick was kind of collateral damage there.
Congratulations, Charlene, on all the advanced praise for Hold My Girl, as well as recently making the Globe and Mail's top 30 Canadian books to read in 2023. Can you tell us your views about that, your reaction when you first heard this news?
I was really excited. And I think it came out the day after my birthday. And so it felt like a little present. Yeah, it was incredibly exciting. I mean, I've been working at being a novelist for about a decade now. And although I've had what I view as beautiful success in the response from readers, it certainly hasn't reached, my other books haven't reached the audience that I hoped they would. And so this advanced praise, it was very fun that in the image, my book was beside Margaret Atwood, who I view as just a literary goddess and is amazing. Yeah, I'm just so thankful that it's reaching audiences. The advanced praise from the authors who have given endorsements for Hold My Girl, they've just been so generous with their time and so much love and so much acceptance. The literary community in Canada is amazing. There were also some US authors who have been so generous and so kind. And, you know, in many ways, they were my first readers, and a lot of them, in addition to the endorsement, sent emails just talking a little bit about their personal experiences or what the book meant to them personally. And it's been a really enriching and fulfilling experience.
So I have a couple here I'd like to read. So one of them is from Shelby Van Pelt, the New York Times bestselling author of Remarkably Bright Creatures, which I had selected last summer as one of my top picks for summer reads. So she says, Charlene Carr pulls off an extraordinary emotional tightrope walk with these imperfect characters and the impossible situation they're thrust into. Each fresh twist had me shifting my sympathies until the very end. Hold My Girl is a beautiful, unflinching examination of what it means to be a mother. So a beautiful review there. Mm-hmm. And we also have Ashley Audrin, the best-selling author of The Push, who wrote Hold My Girl deftly explores the tribulations of motherhood through a compelling narrative that portrays both sides of a headline-making controversy about biology, motherhood, and race. Thoughtful, tense, and affecting, Charlene Carr has skillfully crafted a page-turning story with compassion at its center. So very nice once again. And I found myself very intrigued. I really like the moral kind of compass question of who deserves the baby. I'm not a mother. I haven't been through any of these processes myself or procedures, but still, I wanted to find out what's going to happen to poor baby Rose. So how did you manage to create a piece of writing that would appeal almost to anyone? This is my key question.
Well, let me just first say, I hope that's true. I hope that, oh, my light fell. I hope that a lot of people from different walks of life and experiences are able to, and it's wonderful to hear that you have, and I've had a few women who've talked to me and said, they weren't sure if they would be interested because they've never been interested in motherhood, but they were able to still relate to these characters and, their motivations, their drives in just who they were as women and about having a goal, and whether that goal is motherhood or whether it's something else. And I think, and this is something that came up a lot in the reviews for my earlier books, that perhaps the thing that allows people, even if this isn't a topic that you think would interest you, to really get captivated, is that I always try to create characters who are their own villain, rather than having a specific protagonist and specific antagonists that each main character is both of them, those things for themselves. And so when you're seeing someone on the page who goes through those struggles, and we all go through struggles, and we all have, fatal flaws that throughout our life we're constantly trying to overcome in various ways. I think that's something that is very relatable for many people, whether it's about motherhood, whether it's about, some of the characters have made some choices or have addictions. We all have something that we're fighting in our lives to overcome and to help us become the people that we want to be, that we intend to be. So that's kind of my guess for what pulls people in.
I think at the beginning, I enjoyed Catherine's character from the beginning. I had a harder time with Tess, but then I grew to enjoy her more as the book progressed. But I think with Catherine, I couldn't relate to her as much in the beginning because everything seemed too perfect. So it was only when sort of things started to unravel in the background, and as a reader, you sort of become aware that she's holding up appearances a lot more than maybe we would like to.
Mm-hmm.
So you get a sense of who she really is. And then I feel like, oh, okay, I can identify with her better now.
I think that's what it's about, right? Just pulling back the layers as the story progresses. And it's interesting. So Hold My Girl was optioned for TV shows. And so I talked to a bunch of different production companies and had, calls like this with them. And one of the assistants in one of them brought up that what she really loved about Catherine was she puts on this facade of being so perfect, but really she's messy. Like she's very messy. And at first when she said that, I was kind of like, what? And I started thinking about it, and she is. And you can kind of get hints of that from early on. And then as the novel unfurls, you see more and more of that, and more that in her own way, she struggles just as much as Tess does. It's just a lot more internally rather than having these outward displays that anyone looking on the scene would say like, oh, she's a mess.
Yeah, I think maybe because in the beginning, you really kind of create a picture or a vision of what Catherine looks like, how she presents herself, and her curls are perfect. So later in the novel, when she has her natural hair, I feel like as a reader, you kind of breathe a sigh of relief. Okay, she's just like everyone else.
Yeah.
So I enjoyed that.
Okay.
So congratulations on selling the rights to Blink Studios, as your book will be adapted to the TV screen. That's great. Amazing news. So this is a discussion we had also with some of our previous guests, including Marissa Stapley, Zakia, Delilah Harris, and Cynthia Dupree Sweeney. So different authors have a different take on what's their involvement, or do they want to be involved in the screenplay aspect? So can you tell us about your take on this?
Absolutely. So I think one of the most important things in making my decision is that the hope that the story would stick as the TV adaptation would stick as true to the novel as possible. And that's a big part of why I went with Blink 49, because when in talking to them, they really talked about wanting to keep as much of the specificity as possible and really focusing on motherhood. I don't know if it's going to happen now, but their hope and intention originally was to keep it set in Halifax in Canada. And a number of the other production companies wanted to move it to a city in the US. And so for me, in most US cities, I felt that race would have to play a much larger part in the story. And I was very nervous about the true question of motherhood and these women and their stories being lost if the question of race and that being the deciding factor kind of ended up overtaking. And so Blink 49 also, they offered for me to be an executive producer, which is very exciting and not something that a lot of authors get. And so, I mean, it doesn't mean I actually get to make any decisions, but it means that I'm there at the table and I'm able to offer my opinions and my thoughts, and that they will hear those, which is great, because sometimes we haven't started yet. It hasn't been greenlit or anything. There's stuff in the works, which is very exciting. But yeah, I really look forward to having my voice be a part of the process, because I've definitely heard of other authors who they sign the paper and then they basically hear nothing about it until it's on a screen. So I was really fortunate to be in a position where I had multiple studios interested, which allowed for my screenwrites agent to kind of push for some of these things. So, and I think also Blink 49, they're just so enthusiastic and passionate, and they really have a goal of uplifting Canadian talent. And so I think, maybe if it hadn't been the case that we were not at an auction, they still would have been very interested in hearing my thoughts. That's my sense from them.
And in an ideal world, if you were casting the show, do you have any ideas of who you would like to see play Catherine and play Tess?
I'm sorry that this is so not fun, but I'm not going to answer that, just because I think there are so many wonderful actresses who can do it. And of course, I do have people in my mind who I think would be amazing. But also, whenever that person is chosen, or those people, I'm sure they're going to be amazing. And I just, don't want them to have any thoughts that I wished it was someone else.
Okay, no problem. That's fair. For some reason, I kept picturing Anna de Armas as Tess. She just
I have thought of her, yeah.
Yeah, she kept popping into my
people
mind.
who come to mind, she's been one of them, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Charlene, for taking the time to speak to me today. I don't want to give away too many details of the book, so I am going to open up questions now from the audience. So if anyone has a question to ask Charlene, please raise your hand or put it in the Q&A and we will ask Charlene. And in the meantime, of course, I have additional questions. So Charlene, can you tell us about your writing routine? What is it currently, and did it shift since you've moved away from self-publishing, or since you had your daughter? Like, how has this changed?
Well, obviously, I have a lot less time to write since having my daughter, and especially in the first few years of her life. Now she's in kindergarten, so that gives me solid few hours during the day. And it changes all the time, because writing isn't just writing, it's revising. And so when I'm actually writing, my routine is generally, my recent routine is to get as much as I can, or have that be the first thing I do. So because my agent and one of my editors is in the UK, I do generally feel the need to check email to see if there's anything pressing. But outside of that, I don't look at any email. I don't look at social media. When I'm actually getting out that first draft, I have generally either a word count goal or a time goal. And I can be flexible. If there's one day where it's just not coming out and I'm not hitting that word count goal, I'm not going to, punish myself. But, and then once I hit that, I will, maybe do some other things. And if I still have the energy to write, I will. But I always kind of make that my priority as far as work goes. When I'm in revising, it's really different. I find that I'm more flexible. Like I can revise in the middle of the day and I can revise in the evening, but writing it really, when I'm writing a first draft, it needs to be kind of the first thing I do. Otherwise, I don't have the mental bandwidth to create in that way. Yeah.
Thank you, Charlene. So we do have a question here from the audience. Will you share with us why you lived in so many provinces and did it influence your writing?
Yeah, I guess I grew up in Toronto. My parents moved me to New Brunswick when I was 15. I ended up going to my first year of college in PEI, university back in New Brunswick. I did 2 intensive French programs in Quebec and in British Columbia. And then I moved to Halifax for grad studies. I moved to Newfoundland following my husband when he got married and got a job there. We came back to Halifax. And yeah, I guess in some sense it's influenced my writing in that realizing, and my travels too, I've traveled a lot overseas and I've lived in a couple of different countries as well. And just the realization that wherever you go, people are just people, and there may be different cultures and there may be different focuses. And I think the biggest way is what I was talking about before, and how creating just these flawed characters, there's no good people and there's no bad people. And I don't really think there's good culture or good or bad culture. It's all just everyone looking for love and looking for connection and fighting through whatever in their life gave them hangups and insecurities and flaws, just to try to find that, to find happiness and joy and an ability to share your life with others. And I think my moves really opened my eyes to that, because I remember growing up and thinking like, oh, in these other countries, people must be so different and be so interesting to like know who they are. And of course there are differences, but essentially that we're all just people and we all have the same motivations, I think.
So how was your experience arriving in New Brunswick as a teen, having been moved from Toronto? I'm just imagining that must have been difficult, but I'm curious to get your take on that.
In many ways, it was the worst year of my life. Yeah, that
Okay.
first year. It was
Poor you,
hard.
Charlene, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I mean, I'm past it, but it was hard. I mean, I went from one of the most multicultural cities in the world to a town where there wasn't a single person of completely another race. There were 3 other families that were interracial in my high school. There was a lot of racism. There was a lot of feeling like I didn't fit. I went from having 3 older brothers, but none of them came. So it also suddenly I was an only child, essentially. Yeah, it was intense.
So does any of your family live nearby now?
My parents and the youngest of my older brothers live in New Brunswick now. Yeah.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah.
And for this particular story, did you begin at the start or at the end, and then fill in the blanks?
So I'd
Readers want
say
to know.
I began with the premise, and then directly after that, the end. That was kind of the first thing that I thought of. It was, when it comes down to like actually writing lines in the story, the final lines of the novel are, I think, the first I wrote. And so building the story, building the characters from that point was all about getting to that ending. Yeah. And I don't usually do that. That's pretty rare for me. And actually my first few novels were totally pantsed. So having that ending and then really plotting towards it, it was something that I never used to do in my writing.
So it's a great ending. I'm not going to give it away, and I did not cheat. I'm proud of myself. I don't know if everyone will do the same, but at times I wanted to know the ending, but I did. I waited until the end of the book. I wanted to ask you, because you said you think it would take on a bit of a different life if the series, if it goes ahead, hopefully, was shot in the United States. The question of race would be dealt with in a different manner. And I think the court case also, did you consider that aspect?
I think it would. Yeah. Yeah, I think it definitely would. And even in some of the conversations that I had with the production companies, they really talked about that. They talked about specific people in the media that they kind of wanted to compare and create a character about, and really just build up that racial tension and kind of the warring sides of who deserves this child. I can't recall if anyone specifically mentioned like the judge or the court case, but I think as well, it's just because of the politics in the United States. And not to say that those things don't exist in Canada and don't exist in Halifax, because they do, absolutely. But I do think a lot of the times it's a lot more muted. And especially in a city like Halifax, there's a lot of interracial couples, and there's a lot of biracial children. And so that commonality of, a child who is visibly white having a Black parent is just like, a lot of people see it, more than more than they would in other places, and they're a little more used to it and a little more accepting. And it's certainly not everyone, because obviously, you know, I live in Halifax and I experienced issues of that myself, but I also think if I lived somewhere else, it could have been a lot harder, especially in some cities in the States. And even the choice of being a Black woman who's chosen to be with a white man, as Catherine had, like, I think that would create a lot more tension and a lot more issues, and maybe even some hostility from the Black community as well, not just the white, on that choice. And then throwing in the whole idea, and this comes up in the novel a little bit, of IVF and of people taking life or fertility into their own hands in that way. There's, from what I understand and from what I've seen and what I've researched, there is definitely more of that in the States. Now, whether, you know, it's actually more, or whether people are just more vocal about it, who's to say? But in my research and looking at some of the articles that I found in the US about issues of IVF that were switched, and seeing some of the comments that people wrote about these couples and their decision to even do that was just awful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we had something else pop up in the chat from the audience members. So the question is, what is the message regarding parenthood that you want people to take away from this book, or this work? Sorry.
Yeah. It's hard to say. I don't know that I've thought deeply about parenthood as much as motherhood, though of course they are very, very related. And so, yeah, I guess the message would be very similar, in the sense that biology doesn't really have to play a role or matter. It should be about love and about trying to give children the best life you can give them, and putting aside your own hangups and maybe desires and wants to do what's best for your child. And I think that can apply in many circumstances. I mean, we see these shows, even what first came to mind just right now is it's not anymore, I think, but there was a show about young girls who were on the like the competition circuit, and you've got like 5-year-olds who are wearing makeup and competing against each other, and just this whole idea of the fact that society could let that show be on the air and support it. Like, those parents aren't thinking of their children when they're doing that. They're thinking of themselves, in my opinion, anyways. And yeah, just looking toward parenthood as obviously respecting your own needs and desires, as Catherine kind of realizes at some points in the book, but also focusing on just that love, and kind of trying to let all else go.
I feel like we got that more from the two women than from Patrick, so I'm picking on Patrick again. Maybe other readers will identify with him and his story a little bit better than I have.
And I think too, actually, another thing that came up in talking with the production company, and this is the one that we decided to go through, and one of the men there really wanted to explore Patrick's story more, and that excited me so much, just to get more of his story back in there that had been cut out. Because something that I think this book doesn't explore enough, and if I had the word count, I would have, because there are word count limits when it comes to publishing, is that fertility treatment is really hard on men too. And especially regarding IVF, when it's the woman who's going through all of this. You know, the man has one little role and that's it. And the woman has months and months of treatment that affects her body, like her emotions, her mind. And that can do a lot to us, and it can make us so obsessed with ourselves and our fertility that our partners become, and there is some reference of this in the book, but they become entirely secondary. You know, they're, even before IVF starts, sometimes I think Catherine at one point refers to Patrick as a sperm donor. And when you allow yourself to become so focused on your own fertility, you can become very cruel without intending it. And I've talked to some other women who've experienced that too. And and there's little references of that in the book, but I would have really loved, just for the benefit and the empathy of men who go through this, to be able to dig into that more, because it's difficult, and it's something that I think gets ignored too much. And I think when I was going through that myself, I didn't see that side of it all the time until I was past it a bit. And thankfully I have an amazing and supportive partner who just loved me through it. But honestly, if he had made some of the horrible choices that some men make, like, I don't even feel like I could have blamed him for the way that my own obsession took over at times.
So one character, I won't say where this character fits in, but somebody's mother in the novel is a very hard character. And I was wondering, is this somebody did you draw inspiration from a real life character or just stories? But this kind of, I won't say evil mother, but almost, very hard to deal with mother whose behavior almost influences different outcomes, but I won't say what.
That's really interesting you ask about that, because as I was writing, I don't recall having any sense of drawing from anyone or anywhere. She was just this character that kind of appeared in my mind fully formed. And it wasn't until after, when some people that I knew had beta read and started asking me questions and saying like, oh, she's like this person, or she reminds me of these people I've known, that, it's possible that that's kind of subconsciously where I drew from. And I do know from childhood and just living in such a multicultural city that there are a lot of times when parents who are immigrants, they face a lot of stress and pressure and just this sense of, I think, being torn apart, wanting to connect to their own culture and identity, and seeing their children not embracing that and going into a different direction. And of course it, I would say a lot of the time, or usually, doesn't manifest in the way it manifests for Tessa's mother in the book, but I think sometimes it does. And it, as I said, I don't think I consciously thought of that when I was writing, but I'm guessing that's maybe where it pulled from in some sense, and just, yeah, and also, it just seemed to work for the book.
Yes, it did. It definitely worked. I think that's all the questions we have today for you, Charlene. Thank you so much for being generous with your time. I highly recommend this book, Hold My Girl. You can reserve it at the library. Of course, it's going to be on a wait list, but don't worry, you can get your hands on it. You can also email the librarian, who will guide you on how to purchase this from Paragraph Bookstore if you'd like to do that and have your own copy. So thank you again, Charlene, for joining us and sharing your terrific story. And we can't wait to see it on the small screen, hopefully. Knock on wood.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a delight.
Thank you, Charlene. Have a good rest of your day.
You too.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.